For the last couple of years, there has been a heated debate between theorists as to whether storytelling plays a significant role in video games, or if the actual mechanics and gameplay plays the biggest role in the development of any video game. In this presentation, I will be discussing about both points of view on this topic, while also arguing for both sides of this debate. In this debate on narratology versus ludology, there are two types of game theorists who argue for their respective theory. On one side, there are the narratologists, who are scholars that either claims that games are closely connected to narrative and or that they should be analysed, at least in part, through narratology. Some of the most recognised theorists supporting the use of narrative in video games include Janet Murray and Henry Jenkins. On the other side of this debate are the ludologists, who are theorists that study ludology, which is the study of game structure or gameplay as opposed to the study of games as narratives or games as a visual medium. Such well-recognised theorists that support the study of ludology include Espen Aarseth, Marku Eskeren, and Jesper Juul. Jesper Juul in particular has made a strong impact in the support of ludology, who strongly believes that games should be focused on the gameplay rather than storytelling. In his article Game Telling Stories, Juul points out that some of the simplest games contain narrative, using the game Space Invaders as an example. Juul suggests that our basic knowledge of science fiction, and the title of the game, suggests that the game is about a positive state broken by an external evil force, and that the role of the player is to recreate this original positive state. However, Juul uses the game Star Wars to illustrate his original view. Created in 1983 for the Atari console, Star Wars gives the player the objective of destroying the Death Star using their spaceship. The game is set in 3 phases. The first is in space, the second on the Death Star, and the third is inside the tunnel of the Death Star. Juul believes that phases 1 and 3 only copies a small part of the movie, as the Rebel fleet is absent during the game, while phase 2 has no clear correlate to the movie. In addition, he also suggests that the title Star Wars is the main connection between the game and the movie, and that by removing the title, the connection would not be at all obvious, whilst the game would involve hitting the exhaust port, or simply a square, as Juul calls it. Juul also suggests the prehistory, personal relations, and the rest of the movie is missing. Henry Jenkins, a believer in transmedia storytelling, thinks differently. Jenkins does not believe the game needs to retell the story of Star Wars to enrich and expand our experience of the Star Wars saga. He further states that the player already knows the story of Star Wars before buying the game, and that players would be annoyed if it was just a regurgitation of the original film experience. Jenkins suggests that narrative is created in the game through dialogue from the films, which occur throughout the game. Furthermore, Jenkins believes that games will become part of a larger narrative system with story information communicated through books, film, television, comics, and other media. In Juul's argument against narrative, I believe that his argument is slightly flawed due to the fact that at the beginning of the game, a brief synopsis is given to the player that they must help destroy the Death Star before it is in reach of the Rebel planet, showing that there is a clear narrative, just like Juul's interpretation of Space Invaders as a narrative. Secondly, many modern games follow a narrative from movies, such as King Kong and Lego Lord of the Rings, which recreate certain scenes from the trilogy using the voice acting, music, and camera angles from the movies. In another suggestion by Juul, he believes that flashbacks are not possible in video games, citing the game Doom 2 as his example for this. Juul suggests that the events represented in Doom cannot be past or prior, since we as players can influence them, whilst further suggesting that playing a scene in the present day before jumping to a previous event is not possible, as the first scene would be determined by whatever the player does earlier on the timeline. Jenkins, however, believes that this is to confuse story and plot, while also mentioning that games are no more locked into an eternal present than films are always linear. A recent study was conducted by the University of Wolverhampton and the University of Bournemouth into whether narrative-based video games can potentially be read as authorless literature. For this study, they decided to choose LA Noire, a crime noir game where the player takes the role of Cole Phelps, a detective in 1947 Los Angeles trying to solve a number of cases. After interviewing a number of students and teachers, a conclusion was made that LA Noire could in fact be seen as a digital transformation of a novel, with some students saying the game was like an expandable book, whilst another student described that it almost reminds me of an Agatha Christie novel, especially the Poirot series. However, while some teachers were open to this, some were less certain or more cautious to the idea that literacy theory can be used to study LA Noire. This was described as potentially a generational gap, which I'll be discussing later in this presentation. One certain event that has certainly helped back the claims of narratologists was the creation of turning the Uncharted games into movies. Starting in 2007 exclusively for the PS3, the action-adventure third-person shooter series has achieved critical acclaim and fan admiration for its fun cinematic experience and storytelling, which closely resembles the Indiana Jones films. One such adoring fan, named Andy Gilliland, enjoyed the game so much that he turned each 3 games into movies. Explaining why he created these films on his blog, Andy said that, "I've often heard many people describe these games as like controlling a movie, and have heard many people say that these games are just as fun to watch as they are to play, and I agree with both of those things. That gave me the idea to edit these games into movies." Later describing on his YouTube page, he said that, "In the end, my goal was to make a movie that would be watchable whether the viewer was a fan of Uncharted or not, and whether the viewer was a video game player or not." In order to achieve this, Andy set about using every cinematic scene from the game with a minimum amount of gameplay that wouldn't cause any plot holes, whilst also removing chapter titles and button prompts to make it seem less like a game. This shows how games have developed in such a way that they can be viewed without the need to be played, thus putting a dent into ludologists' claims. However, a particular game series that backs up ludologists' claims is the Super Mario series. Having been around for almost 30 years, the Italian plumber has featured in over 100 games and is seen as the icon of video games. In the number of games that he has starred in, the storyline for most of these follow a basic structure. Someone is kidnapped, mainly Princess Peach by Bowser, Mario sets out to rescue the person, and Mario saves the person. If it wasn't for the imaginative gameplay that has kept reinventing itself over the years, do you really think that Super Mario would be so successful for almost 30 years with this basic plot structure? Overall, both theories make strong points to represent themselves as a dominant theory. Technology has developed rapidly since the early days of video gaming, which has allowed developers to experiment and improve on both the game mechanics and narrative of video games. As the years have progressed, video games have become as big as the film industry, with many gamers wanting to engage in a deeper storytelling experience to match that, or better, the likes of Hollywood blockbusters. There have been many games with storytelling experiences over the past few years, with The Last of Us, The Walking Dead, Heavy Rain, BioShock Infinite, and Beyond Two Souls, just to name a few, with many games having some sort of narrative embedded in them. With these games becoming more narrative based, many phone and tablet games, such as Angry Birds, Temple Run, and Fruit Ninja, are being played because of their game mechanics rather than their basic narrative. Seeing as Jewel and many other ludologists seem to compare the narrative within older games, these ludologists may possibly be in denial that games can take on narrative that can immerse the player due to a potential generational gap that was mentioned in the study into LA Noire, seen as the technology has improved to create a deeper storytelling experience. However, Jewel suggests we should not forget what makes games games: rules, goals, player activity, the projection of the player's actions into the game world, and the way the game defines the possible actions of the players. So I ask you this: Why do you think that narrative does, or does not, play a significant role in video games?